Good afternoon. I'm Sandro Megrelishvili from GCSD, Georgian Center for Strategy and Development, and I should state that I'm super happy to be moderating this panel, which is a new order in making Russia's war in Ukraine and NATO's response. So we are continuing our important discussion, which started during the previous panels. And during this panel, during following 1 hour, we'll try to understand, grasp how the international security indeed has changed and how the NATO responded. And also we'll look at Georgia. What are the consequences for Georgia of this geopolitical earthquake, as they would say? So for this, we have excellent guests, excellent speakers. And left from my side, we have His Excellency, Ambassador David Quarrey. So he is permanent representative of United Kingdom to NATO. And I should highlight that he just arrived from the airport. So thank you for your dedication. Thank you for being with us. Next, we have Ms. Natia Seskuria, founder of RISS, the new think tank organization, as well as fellow at RUSI, the formidable think tank in United Kingdom. Next, we have His Excellency, Ambassador Răzvan Rotundu, Ambassador of Romania to Georgia since 2021. And last, and for sure not least, we have Dr. Shea with us. He is currently Associate Fellow at Chatham House. He used to be NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, and he's been in NATO for 38 years. I should highlight that as well. So welcome all of you, and thank you for your time. So I think we can kick off, and before I'll ask my first question, I'll reiterate that we'll carry in the similar fashion. I'll ask a few questions. The speakers will have around 5 minutes for each question, and then we'll ask the audience also to engage and ask questions for our speakers. So first question I would like to ask to dear Dr. Shea, as we have discussed during our previous conversations, it was actually before the war, before Russia's intervention in Ukraine, we were already speaking how the world indeed has been transforming. And this transformation indeed has been fundamental. And actually that has been reflected in the NATO documents, including the communique of most recent summit, as well as in Madrid in the concept document. So without further my interpretation, I would like to ask you to describe the change which has happened in the geopolitical realm, in the security architecture. I'll ask you if in your opinion, how the balance of power has changed in Europe, as well as, you're a historian, and if you could compare the current situation with any other historic period. And I know that this is a pretty tough question to start with, but we do trust in your skills and knowledge, so floor is yours.
Well, Sandro, thanks so much for inviting me to participate. I clearly regret not being there in person because it's always much more pleasant, and you don't have to worry about internet connections, thank God, which I have to at the moment. So I really keep my fingers crossed that I'm not going to be sort of cut off in full flight. Greetings to the ambassador. We haven't managed to meet yet in Brussels, but I hope that will nonetheless be rectified in the near future. And greetings to all fellow panelists. So thanks for the invitation to participate. I will go fast. All wars, Sandro, Sandro, as you well know, particularly European wars, produce attempts at creating a post-war order which will prevent the conflict from reoccurring, often by continuing from the conflict into peacetime, the wartime coalition. As, if you like, a group of policemen, to use President Roosevelt's term in 1945, who will together sort of maintain the post-war order. You think of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, you obviously think of the League of Nations and the war to end all wars that came out of World War I. Of course, the system, Bretton Woods, UN, the multilateral institutions, including NATO, that emerged from World War II, based on the UN Security Council, which of course was the coalition of wartime allies. That last one, Sandro, has probably been the most successful in terms of its longevity, although not without strains, as all orders face strains sooner or later, both internal and external, and in the sense of the universality, this ability to spread beyond the immediate area of a conflict to embrace a large number of countries in the world. Now, very briefly, what I see emerging from Ukraine at the moment is, first of all, an enormous strengthening of the West. I know that the ambassador and others will comment on this, and it's an obvious point to make, but the West has really come together in an unprecedented way. The recommitment of the United States to the defense of Europe, the recommitment of the US to multilateralism, across the board, not just in defence, but in areas such as climate change, the much improved EU-US partnership in dealing with global economic and trading issues. You see, of course, also the way in which NATO has pulled together, more of that, no doubt, in the panel, and the decision of Sweden and Finland. I didn't think in my lifetime that I would see that, having worked with those two countries as close partners during my time at NATO, but joining, one has joined, and hopefully the other will join soon, the alliance. But you also see, I think, not just NATO, the EU has also now taken a momentous decision on the back of the Ukraine war, which I know is, of course, particularly important to Georgia as a candidate country, to make the European Union consistent with the European continent in terms of reaching out, not just to Ukraine and Moldova, but to the Western Balkans and the 10 candidate countries, which envision a EU of at least 30 states, if we're to believe the EU Council President Charles Michel, by 2030, and perhaps 40 states by the middle of the century. As Ursula von der Leyen said in her Council State of Europe speech at Strasbourg last week, this is going to be a long and difficult process, but the decision to move forward has now become irreversible. And also, and I've written many articles as a think tanker now on this, the way in which the European Union is stepping up its efforts in security defence by spending money, by procuring armaments, by training Ukrainian soldiers in a way which is helpful to the collective defence of NATO. I would also salute the role of the G7, which has really been revitalised on the back of Ukraine as a kind of directorate of the global democracies, including, of course, Japan, and which has done a lot to impose sanctions on Russia, engage Africa, and come up with, if you like, a better deal, particularly vis-à-vis the global south and the less developed countries, than what we see currently coming from Russia and China. And of course offer the security guarantees to Ukraine on the margins of the NATO's Vilnius summit, which are now being implemented. Finally, Sandro, on the good news front, I would point to the way in which the Ukraine war has brought the Indo-Pacific and Europe and the United States, the Atlantic community and the Pacific community, much closer together, as exemplified in the two summits now that NATO has held with its Indo-Pacific global partners, and the way in which increasingly the Indo-Pacific, when we look at China, when we look at North Korea, is seeing issues in similar terms to the way that we see them in Ukraine. Peace in Ukraine also will help peace in the Indo-Pacific. The two strategic theatres are coming more closely together. As the ambassador knows, the UK itself is playing a major role there in terms of the AUKUS partnership with Australia and the United States, and the UK's partnership with Japan. And the way in which, for example, when yesterday Lloyd Austin brought together the Ukraine contact group in Ramstein to look at the future of our military support to Kiev, a number of the representatives there were the Indo-Pacific partners that have been so helpful in that effort. Now, Sandro, very briefly, my time is almost up. As a NATO official, I would have ended my speech there and only addressed the good side of the story. But for the last 5 years, unfortunately, I've no longer had the privilege of being a NATO official. I've been relegated to the lowly think tank world. And our job now is to look at the darker side. I could spend many hours on this. I don't have them. So let me briefly mention that, of course, as with the good news, inevitably there's the bad news. We're now seeing, if you like, if I could call it the camp of the opposition, I wouldn't use this term officially, but we're now seeing the autocracies, unfortunately, also pull together in a kind of counter-alliance to the West. You know, Putin, North Korea, this past week, China, Russia, though in which Iran has come much closer into the Russian and Chinese orbit. The instrumentalization of the BRICS recently in South Africa with the enlargement of the BRICS, again, to try to form a counterweight to the West. I'm not sure if it's going to be successful. There are divisions among the BRICS. Everything is 50 shades of grey and never black and white. But clearly we are now seeing a kind of counter move on the other side. And clearly we have also seen on the back of Ukraine that taking the global south for granted in the UN General Assembly or elsewhere is something that we can no longer do. A number of countries we thought would be allies have been fence-sitters, have been secretly aiding Russia, have been, if you like, trying to sort of be in both camps at once. So we're dealing with a much more complex world. The Ukraine crisis has revealed that. The Ukraine war has also shown that whatever we think the stakes are for European security, the conflict has global repercussions as well. And part of the successful diplomacy is dealing with those global repercussions. And I'm sure that's going to be the theme of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York today and this week when it comes to what we can do to help the food supply chains, to help with debt, with the global south, and as I mentioned, improve our offer. Another big issue which I think obviously we have to look at is, unfortunately, as the West consolidates and the authoritarians try to do the same, the UN, the global institutions particularly, are the ones that suffer. In fact, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, has said that has called it the great ripping. The Security Council has been largely paralysed, of course, in dealing with the war in Ukraine, although the UN has played a useful role on the Black Sea grain embargo. But we see it's these sort of the glue that holds the system together, in which we Westerners have a key interest in terms of establishing the rules of the road of multilateralism, is suffering. Finally, two things, if I may, to conclude with. We see also that we're in for a long haul when it comes to Ukraine and the NATO's defence and deterrence. The war in Ukraine, I think, will drag on for a number of years. And even if the Ukraine war is satisfactorily resolved, whatever our definition of that is, the challenge of Russia and China and other authoritarians to the West will endure. So one of the challenges that we've got now is to persuade our populations to accept a level of sacrifice, defence spending, rearmament, mobilisation, resilience, citizen awareness, which they have not been used to since the last century. Maintaining the course, maintaining morale, keeping support for Ukraine. This is going to be a major issue of political leadership. Winston Churchill once said in a speech that all he could offer the British people was blood, sweat and tears. Well, I wouldn't go that far, of course. The Western way of life is preserved, our economic prosperity, but we clearly see that in terms of what we now have to do to be secure is going to require a much greater effort as well as we sustain this particular effort going forward. And we clearly see that in a much more complicated world, Europe itself is going to have to step up its game, reduce its dependencies, and stand on its own feet, particularly at a time when the United States, of course, will be obviously looking at the Indo-Pacific as well. So how would the United States, we sort out some kind of burden-sharing role which gets Europeans more involved in the Indo-Pacific security as a quid pro quo for the continuing American engagement in Atlantic security? Pulling those theatres together, increasingly, as I described, will be a challenge as well. So, as I said, I think there's plenty of good news for NATO officials, but also for keeping think tankers like me busy with all kinds of articles and hopefully constructive proposals. Unfortunately, there is always a dark side of the moon, and many challenges have come out of the Ukraine war for us as well. Thanks very much.
Dr. Shea, thank you for your Command, for the general overview you gave for us to start. Now I'd like to refer to Ambassador, and I would like to ask, I was watching one of your recent interviews before the Vilnius summit, where you mentioned that there is a big moment for now in NATO and that changes are fundamental and so on. So I would like to ask, we have seen huge geopolitical changes, and how would you assess NATO's response? What are the key decisions, and then those decisions have been made, and do you feel and do you think that nations are committed to fulfilling them, to bringing them to action? So please.
Great, thanks very much, Sandro. It's really good to be back in Tbilisi. It's my second visit this year. The UK, along with our Romanian friends, are the contact point embassies for Georgia, and we take that responsibility very seriously and see it as a great opportunity to deepen this conversation. But I think my starting point would be that I agree with Jamie's presentation, and there have been lots of positives. But it is a more complex, challenging, and likely conflicted world that we are going to be living in, almost certainly, for the next few years and probably decades. And NATO has had to respond, as other international organisations have, to that. And I think overall, the message is pretty positive in terms of how NATO has responded. But we've got to be clear about the scale of the challenge. And this didn't just start on the 24th of February last year. That in a way was a crystallisation of trends that we've seen for a number of years. A much more difficult, reckless Russia, a more complex global environment, a more fragmented security environment across the Euro-Atlantic area. So it is quite a tough picture there. But I think on the whole, we should be pleased with the way that NATO has responded. Now, NATO is a political military alliance, and I think in both political and military terms, NATO is stronger now than it has been for many years. You see the degree of political unity that we saw both at the Madrid summit last year and at the Vilnius summit this year. We heard a lot of talk before the conflict about how we would all hold together. We heard a lot of speculation last winter about would our allies hold together in their support for Ukraine. Actually, that support has been rock solid in terms of determination to deter Russia and defend if necessary, but also to continue supporting Ukraine and other partners. Finland joining, Sweden soon to join. We are confident that will happen soon. That is an enormous political moment for the alliance. It is an enormous political as well as military moment for the alliance. I think all of this sort of captured in the strategic concept that we saw from the Madrid summit last year speaks to an alliance that is politically more united than ever before. Militarily, there is a revolution going on, really, within the alliance. It is the most important transformation of the alliance's military capabilities since the end of the Cold War. We have seen that through agreement on the new military plans that were approved at the Vilnius summit this year, through the new NATO force model, which makes a lot more forces available at much higher levels of readiness to secure. We've seen it in the commitment on 2%. We've firmed up that commitment. So it's a floor, not a ceiling. It's a permanent commitment now. We are working hard to strengthen NATO's defence industrial base, because we've all seen how much work is required there. We're also trying to, at the same time, anticipate and adapt to and prepare for some of the many global challenges that we'll see. Some of this is about the growing challenge that China poses to our security interests and values. Much of it is about broader threats, cyber, hybrid, disinformation. Georgia knows these only too well, unfortunately. So we are trying to get the alliance match fit for those challenges of the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years as well. We're also trying to do a lot to strengthen NATO's global partnerships. There is huge appetite from many countries around the world to deepen those partnerships with NATO. Jamie mentioned the deepening relationship with the Asia-Pacific Four, as we call them in NATO, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. We're agreeing really new ambitious partnership plans for each of those. So it's not just about talk, it's about action, doing more together, anticipating the big global challenges. We're trying to do more with other partner countries, including Georgia, and I'm sure we will dig into that in more depth as we go through. But we were very clear at the Vilnius summit in terms of reaffirming the direction of travel that we want to see with Georgia, to reaffirm our support for Georgian membership for the Euro-Atlantic trajectory, but also the need for Georgia to move forward with the reforms that will enable movement along that path. So it's a huge agenda. It's a big and complex agenda that the alliance is taking through at the moment. And if you see, the Madrid summit last year, in a way, set the intellectual framework for that through the strategic concept. The Vilnius summit this year was important in implementing at a strategic level many of those changes, including the new regional military plans. And then next July, we will have the Washington summit, very important as the 75th anniversary of the world's most successful political military alliance. We'll want to see further implementation by then. But we must never be complacent because of the complexity of the world that we are in at the moment and that we are likely to be in for some time. But overall, I think we should be pretty satisfied with the changes that NATO has introduced, which, as I say, add up, in our view, to the biggest transformation for the alliance since the end of the Cold War.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for your answer, and we'll come back to the issues you mentioned, hopefully, during our discussion. Now, I'd like to ask Ambassador Rotundu to share his perspective from Romania. So we know that the eastern flank of NATO has been one of the vulnerable. Possibly Baltic countries have been in a more vulnerable position, but still we know that NATO has made decisions to strengthen the eastern flank, and we know the enhancement with forces, and this whole transformation going on is partially response to the need to strengthen the eastern flank. So I would like to ask you, how do you see, from your perspective, is Romania secure, and is deterrence and defense of NATO working? Please.
Good evening, Sandro, and good evening. Thank you very much for hosting this, and greetings to our to the co-panelists. Now, thank you very much. As you know, Romania has been, ever since our accession in NATO in 2004, one of the proponents of an enforcement of the eastern flank of NATO, and especially in the west, western part of the Black Sea Basin. Now, perhaps the time was not ripe, but I'm afraid after 2008 in Georgia, and especially after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when Russia Federation destroyed basically the fundamentals of the post-war consensus on the international law, did show the need for an enhancement of the NATO presence in this part of Europe. Currently, Romania is very happy with the decisions taken in both during the Madrid and Vilnius to reinforce NATO presence and the creation of 4 more battle groups in southeastern Europe. As you know, Romania is hosting already, and also the decision to strengthen the NATO air and missile defense is a very good one, and we are very happy. Meanwhile, ever since the new aggression of Russia against Ukraine after 2022, we have seen attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure, first on Odessa and recently on the Danube ports. Now, this creates a situation where which resulted in fragments of drones landing in Romanian territory. And we have seen that yesterday the press release of the Bulgarian Defense Ministry that also they arrived also on Bulgarian territory. We think this. We think that the NATO deterrence and defense in the Black Sea Basin needs to be reinforced, and in order to assure better protection of our territories against the Russian attacks. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you, and absolutely agree that further steps are needed in order to enhance Black Sea security, which also will be very beneficial for Georgia. So now I'd like to ask Ms. Natia let's focus a little bit on Georgia as well. So we know that since regaining independence in 1991, Georgia has been challenged by threats, terrible threats, those which were not only destabilizing the country, but also of the nature of survival was under question. And indeed, the war going on in Ukraine, we look at the war with very cautious optimism, with the hope that it will bring changes which will also create more security, bring more security, and also potentially open further doors for us for NATO membership. But having said that, I would like to ask, how do you see how the war has indeed challenged us? What are the threats which have been either created or further strengthened, and also what are the opportunities which might arise as in consequence? Please.
Thank you, Sandro. Thanks very much for hosting this wonderful event. Thanks to the NATO Liaison Office as well as the NATO Contact Point embassies, the UK Embassy in Georgia and Romanian Embassy in Georgia, as well as, of course, GCSD. That is a very timely and very important question for Georgia, and I certainly think that the shifts that our distinguished panelists have pointed out and have described have a very fundamental impact on Georgian security and Georgia's future. And I certainly think that the future of Georgia, and this is not just words, I believe that our future is also being decided in Ukraine and is directly dependent on the outcome of the war. So is the European security, future of the European security. And to focus on Georgia, of course, I think, Sandro, you have rightly pointed out, and the Ambassador has also emphasized on this, these are not the threats that are new to Georgian reality. Of course, but I think the war in Ukraine has definitely exacerbated some of these threats and have made things worse in several dimensions. And I would like to focus on some of these threats specifically, but also about the opportunities that have been given to Georgia and will be given potentially to Georgia as a result of this unprecedented unity that we see among the NATO allies in terms of supporting Ukraine. Firstly, of course, I think the internal landscape in Georgia is very tense, and we see that the disinformation, cyber activities, as well as the infiltration from the Russian side through the local enablers have become a very prominent problem. These problems have always existed, but I think some of these forces, actors who are trying to capitalize on the war in Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine are using the current situation, current vulnerabilities in Georgia to focus on diminishing the support, overall support of the Georgian population towards the European and Euro-Atlantic path. And of course, when we look at the polls, it gives us a very hopeful picture. And I certainly don't think that we will see any swift changes tomorrow. But I think this is very much in line with the long-term strategy that Russia has been trying to push forward in this country. And this is a very fertile ground for Russia to use the current realities and to focus directly on some of the perceptions in several groups of societal groups, and to use the vulnerabilities, the existing vulnerabilities. And I'll try to give several examples. So in terms of disinformation, I think disinformation has become over the years a very pressing problem for Georgia. And we see some of the new narratives emerging in light of the war in Ukraine, such as the so-called threat of a second front. Some of the actors are trying to push this narrative within the context of the West trying to somehow engage Georgia into the war and somehow trying to terrorize the population, maybe those who have less information about the current ongoing realities, to basically change their perceptions and focus on the benefits of having a neutral political stance or a political standing that is slightly more favorable towards Russia or slightly more accommodating towards Russia. And I mean, from proper military point of view, we see what's happening in Ukraine right now. We see that Russia has a lot of different problems, and this is probably a discussion for a whole new panel if we just go into depth of these problems. There is definitely, of course, the threats are there, and of course, 20% of Georgia's territories are occupied. The borderization still continues, but at this very moment, Russia simply cannot afford to open up a second front in Georgia. And at the same time, the narrative of having the West interested into pushing Georgia towards that way is complete nonsense, I would say, because simply because if we look at how much the West has been investing and is investing currently in terms of building Georgia's resilience, defense capabilities, as well as economic resilience, as well as helping us to fight against disinformation, helping us to tackle the cyber challenges, for example, and this list is obviously very long. This simply undermines this narrative very heavily that there is some grounds of truth in that. However, we see that there are certain channels that are able to, as I've mentioned, use the existing vulnerabilities and misinform people through instigating this fear of war. And obviously, this is a very vulnerable topic in a sense that, of course, this country has a trauma of has undergone wars, and most recently, of course, in 2008. And of course, this gives Russia a hand in terms of pushing this narrative and promoting this. Apart from this, of course, there are various other threats, and we see that Georgia's internal security has shifted a lot in terms of hosting, accommodating a lot of Russians. I would not name the actual number because this is inarguable. Then we don't know the actual numbers, but everybody feels the presence. Everybody feels that, especially since the announcement of mobilization, the internal security landscape has changed. And this is a topic that is directly related to security, I think, because we don't really know what are their intentions. We don't really know how some of them can be weaponized from the Russian security services into inflicting chaos in this country and politically destabilize the country and pursue their own goals in terms of diminishing and decreasing the support for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And at the same time, we have the current reality when Georgia has a historic opportunity in terms of the European candidacy status, and I think this is an opportunity that is given to Georgia primarily because of the regional security environment and because of the current ongoing tragic events in Ukraine. However, this opportunity will not be there for a long time, and this is a moment when Georgia needs to use this moment, this window of opportunity, in order to move ahead with its aspirations. Now, as we speak, it is a very crucial moment, I think, this time round, because in a few weeks' time, we will have the assessment of Georgia's progress when it comes to the accomplishment of the 12 recommendations that the EU put forward for us, and certainly, I think missing this opportunity would be a huge tragedy for Georgia. I think putting Georgia out of the basket of the associated trio, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, would be an opportunity that we cannot afford simply to miss. And of course, when it comes to opportunities, I think the unity that we see among our European allies, among our NATO allies, is something that gives Georgia a solid ground to further build the partnerships. We, of course, have our partners who help us in all sorts of various ways and who are very much committed to help Georgia to succeed on this path. But I think more proactive standing is what our partners are asking for from Georgia, because this is the time when all of the threats that are present currently in this region are assessed in a very objective way. We might argue that in some ways, couple of years ago, the threats that were present in the Black Sea region were underestimated, but the Ukraine war has really made a Black Sea security as a main focus for the Euro-Atlantic, one of the main focuses for the Euro-Atlantic community. So this, of course, gives Georgia a unique chance to promote its own interest and agenda at the time when everybody agrees that without securing the Black Sea, we cannot really discuss about sustainable peace and sustainable stability within the European security framework.
Thank you. You basically covered the both questions I had for you. So just to make a small comment on that, indeed we see that Russia is not as strong as it was thought militarily, but it still continues to be very strong in hybrid warfare. To comment on the informational warfare against Georgia, and for sure we need to challenge that and react. Now I would like to go back to Dr. Shea and to Ambassador. This question is for both of you. So we saw that part of Western response to the changed security environment was strengthening NATO, defense and deterrence and transforming and so on. But also the other part was supporting Ukraine, both militarily and financially and in other ways as well. And indeed, we should highlight that without Western support, Ukraine possibly wouldn't survive in those early days, and the support was critical. But I should also highlight that as the Ukrainian counteroffensive is under the way, there are many critics, including in the European capitals, who think that the support is insufficient, they don't like the level and the speed as well. So I would like to ask you to comment, firstly, to assess the support of the West, which it has given to Ukraine, and how do you see the overall strategy of NATO and NATO member countries to counter Russia in Ukraine? So please, Dr. Shea, and then we'll come to you.
Well, Sandro, thanks very much. I mean, that's a big question, and we could spend many hours discussing it. The first thing I would say is that we should not be overly critical of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. There are people who believe that the Ukrainians should be able to fight a US way of war with combined arms operations, moving quickly over territory. That's certainly some of the training that they've been receiving in Germany. But anybody who has been at the front, I haven't been at the front, but as a think tanker, I speak to people who really do know about this and who have been there, will say that it's simply not practicable. It's not possible for the Ukrainians to fight that kind of battle at the moment, given the intense fortifications that the Russians have built up, and which really means that, unfortunately, for the time being, the Ukrainians are only able to advance square kilometre by square kilometre because of the extensive mining and the fortifications. That said, the Ukrainians have advanced. They've captured 2 villages around Bakhmut in recent days. They've parried a Russian offensive south of Kharkiv, where the Russians were trying to open a second front, and they are now finally punching through the Russian first line and making some progress towards Melitopol and the Crimea in the south. So it's not over yet, and although certain people speak about winter is coming, which it certainly is, and the season of mud, my sense is that Ukraine will not stop the offensive at the beginning of October, but will continue at least as long as conditions permit throughout the winter. So I think we have to have an understanding, particularly from a Western military point of view, that what the Ukrainians are up against in terms of density of minefields or fortifications is unprecedented, and we can't expect them simply to punch through with tanks and armoured personnel carriers as much as what we would wish. But they are making progress. Morale on the Russian side is low. The Russians clearly are only able to hold their positions by bringing in air assault units and a lot of troops, mobilising a lot of troops as well. So we'll wait and see. But that said, I said earlier that I think, regrettably, as much as we would all like to see Ukraine liberate its territory this year, I think the conflict is going to go into the second year. And as I said at the end of my remarks, Sandro, the ability of the West to continue to support, particularly I mentioned that G7 decision on the long-term security guarantees, long-term military support, the Ramstein contact group, all of these efforts have to be maintained, because Ukraine's security is our security. So that would be my first point. I think the second point, of course, is essentially at the same time to get Ukraine through the winter. Russia, no doubt, is going to try once again its cynical strategy of targeting civilian infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, water supplies, blowing up dams. Russia is now practicing environmental warfare on a grand scale, causing as much chaos. And I think last winter, by NATO, but also the EU and other institutions, there was a magnificent effort to make sure that in terms of supplying Ukraine with generators, with all kinds of heating materials, with energy, we were able to keep the Ukrainian population fed and warm and through that particular winter. And I think we're going to need the same effort again. So I think we have to be realistic. I think the spring offensive was a bit overhyped, inevitably, because everybody, of course, was hoping that it would be decisive, particularly after the Ukrainian successes at the end of last year at Kherson and Kharkiv, but we have to be realistic. But the most important thing is to give Ukraine sufficient amounts of weapons so it can keep the pressure on the Russians. My great fear, Sandro, this will be my last comment before I listen to the ambassador, but my great fear is that if the supplies run short and they're not able to keep the pressure on the Russians, as they did last winter, Sandro, will simply use the break to build even more fortifications, a 5th line, a 6th line, a Maginot line, a Siegfried line, to use 20th century warfare analogies, making it even harder for a new offensive to go ahead. But I think, it's easy to be an armchair strategist and criticize the slow pace of advance, but every general, Western general, who's actually been on the front line will say there is no really alternative to the way the Ukrainians are doing it at the moment, because any other strategy would be military suicide and would lose them thousands of casualties and lots more materiel. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Ambassador Quarrey?
Thank you. I'd just start really by underlining Jamie's last point. You won't hear any criticism of how the Ukrainians are doing this out of our system. They are fighting under unbelievably difficult conditions without air superiority through, as Jamie said, extraordinary density of defensive preparations by the Russians, and they are doing it in a way which protects lives on their side, protects their heavy arm. So they are fighting hard. They know how to do it. Now our job is to give them as much support as we can as they take that forward. I agree with Jamie, this is going to be a long haul. We've certainly got to be ready for it to be a long haul. I think we have done well over the last 18 months or so in continually expanding both in terms of quantity and quality the kind of support that we are providing to Ukraine. Some of that will happen on a slower burn, like the F-16s. You can't turn on an F-16 capability overnight. It takes time. Some things can happen much more quickly. But our job, first of all, is to be in it for the long haul and to be absolutely clear in our signalling that we are in this for the long haul. And that's one of the reasons that the G7 plus assurances are important. The second thing is to make sure we can actually deliver it, because it is absolutely fine just writing it down at Vilnius or somewhere else that we're going to do all this if we don't have the industrial capacity to deliver it. And that's why really one of the critical areas of leaders' attention at Vilnius was about how we get our defence industries onto a much more sustainable footing, both to rebuild our own stockpiles, because we have gifted so much kit, absolutely rightly, to the Ukrainians, but also to show to the Russians that we can keep generating and that we will keep outpacing them, that our pockets are deeper than theirs, that our technological capabilities are better than theirs, and that we will be in this for even longer than they are. So I think it's very difficult to say now precisely what kind of capabilities the Ukrainians will need next February. Yeah, these things evolve. They've evolved all the way through the conflict, and that's been one of the successes of Western support, I think. We found a division of labour between individual allies and others, providing all kinds of extraordinary lethal capabilities, while NATO provides some longer-term, non-lethal support as well as practical short-term stuff. So let's keep doing all that, but we must make sure that we have the capacity to deliver all this, and that's why this programme of work with defence industries is really one of the most important things that we're doing at the moment.
Ambassador Quarrey, as you just brought this point, let me give you a follow-up question. Do we feel the commitment in the Western world, in European states, to develop the industrial capacity which is necessary? We know that it has been mentioned many times in the documents as well, but how serious are the governments?
No, I think governments are serious. Yeah, we are making important commitments on this. Now we've got to turn them into reality. And again, this is not something that you can just immediately turn on and off, and it needs a whole set of strands of work on this. We've all become experts on 155 artillery over the last 18 months, but you know, it is madness at the moment that you have all these different kinds of 155, which are not interoperable, not interchangeable between different allies. So there is the whole big standardization bit, which, for example, is an area that NATO ought to lead on, not just setting the standards, but kind of enforcing those standards on allies. There is a whole big bit about how we come together in multinational, multi-year procurement. We've done it in our own system where we've got such exquisitely defined procurement processes that they're not even interdeployable across our own services, let alone with other allies. We need to get away from that. We need to get back to producing at volume in a way that can be used by a whole bunch of different allies and partners as well. Our industries say they need a clearer long-term demand signal on all of this. So how do we work together to make sure they've got that kind of clarity over time? But it's not something you can just switch on and off overnight. But I think governments are absolutely serious about it. And frankly, we have all learned some pretty tough lessons for ourselves, that if we ever got into conflict with a peer competitor, that we need to be doing rather better in terms of stockpiles, industrial capability than we are at the moment. So a lot of it's about Ukraine, a lot of it's about us, a lot of it's about us as well.
That's true, absolutely. Thank you. My last question, and then I'll ask the audience to also join in. So, Ambassador, you have also mentioned Black Sea security, and this has been topic. It's kind of a buzzword for recent years. And I would like to ask you to elaborate more on the strategic importance of the Black Sea. And also, what do you see, what are the next steps for NATO to take in order to enhance Black Sea security? Please.
Thank you very much, Sandro. Now, let me rewind a bit the situation. Romania has been arguing about the importance of the Black Sea since early 90s, not just because it was not in a monomaniacal phase, but because we saw the Black Sea was the region in which post-Soviet Russia started and benefited from the conflicts, like in the Republic of Moldova in 1992, or in Abkhazia in Georgia in 1992-1993. It was the pattern upon which the policy of Russia developed, benefiting from a frozen conflict, and then appearing as both as a guarantor of the status quo, and in the meantime acting overtly or covertly in this respect. When Romania did join NATO in 2004, it drew the attention upon this, the fact that the Black Sea was a bit ignored, both in NATO and the European Union. And unfortunately, the aggressions in 2008 and 2014, not to mention 2022, proved that our warnings were not delusions, as it has been called sometimes. But they were. We have seen the signs of the war for a long time. Today, the situation as it presents itself is that the Black Sea is an area that finally has been whose importance has been acknowledged by the NATO strategic concept, and we see, unfortunately, is an area in which NATO has still work to do in order to ensure the full access in the Black Sea. And in this respect, Romania will continue to work in NATO and together with all the allies in this respect. It's work in progress, and even though there are good signs, there is also a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Natia, as discussed, Black Sea indeed is, let's put it this way, area where Georgia and NATO could cooperate more closely, if there is such a will. So, what's your perspective? What are the steps from Georgia's side which we could make in order to strengthen this partnership, specifically focusing on the Black Sea security?
Yes, absolutely. Is this on?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to the Black Sea, there are opportunities that Georgia needs to be using because the importance of the Black Sea has become very much obvious for our allies. And as Ambassador mentioned, despite Romanian efforts to put an emphasis on this region, there wasn't really a sense or identification of how important it was external, let's put it that way, external engagement in the Black Sea. And there wasn't a perception that Black Sea was turned as a Russian lake because of Russia's efforts to militarize the Black Sea, and we may argue that it started in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia, but it became more and more obvious in 2014, since 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and subsequent efforts of Russia to militarize the Black Sea. And now we have the reality when countries, European allies, NATO allies, are reassessing their policies toward this region, and also there is a discussion about the elaboration of the national strategies. We know that the US we will probably and hopefully see a US's Black Sea strategy sometime soon. I think that is very important, and that puts the Black Sea under the highlight. But what should Georgia do in this context? Of course, I think this question is very much related to what we've discussed in terms of hybrid threats and building resilience. And in that sense, I do see Georgia's role and Georgia's efforts to build this resilience only in partnership with our allies. And we have some strong sectoral cooperation, for instance, with our UK partners in terms of cyber resilience, for example. A number of countries, including NATO, EU, are helping us to build resilience in all sorts of ways to tackle some the problems related to Russia's hybrid activities in this country. At the same time, I think bilateral cooperations are very important. And in that sense, of course, I would place an emphasis on building these partnerships with Romania and Bulgaria. And especially in light of the war in Ukraine, it became very much obvious that Romania has a very prominent role in terms of ensuring and the European security, as well as putting this agenda of the Black Sea security, of securing the Black Sea on top of the NATO agenda. And at the same time, I would touch a very painful topic, I would say, Georgia-Ukrainian relationships, which has been, unfortunately, one of the deteriorations that we've seen in light of the war, is anomalically, I would say, the relationships between these two countries. And my prediction, let's say, and this is not something that I came up with, I think a lot of experts would agree that whenever the war is over in Ukraine, we will see Ukraine as a dominant country in the region, with a very capable armed forces, with a very pro-Western, pro-NATO agenda. And in that sense, I think it is absolutely crucial for Georgia to have a close partnership with Ukraine. And unfortunately, what we see now is that a certain political there are a lot of different political reasons why this partnership has been deteriorating. And I don't certainly think that this is within Georgia's best interest. And finally, I know we are running out of time, but definitely the trade economic potential of the Black Sea must be used by Georgia. And in that sense, of course, Natia port, for example, is a wonderful example. And unfortunately, if the project went ahead, and if, the projection was, I think, that in 2020 we would have it operational. We know what happened, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I think this is a strategic interest for Georgia to place the country as not only a beneficiary of the Black Sea security framework and the interests of external actors, in this case non-littoral actors within the Black Sea, but also a country that can actually contribute to the Black Sea. And in that sense, of course, the trade connectivity potential is very much obvious in light of the war in Ukraine, when our allies are trying to part ways and do it as soon as possible in terms of diminishing their dependency on Russia.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, let's give, I hope you will allow me, although we are running a bit late, but let's give some opportunity to the audience as well.
Good evening. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Moger from Hungarian Air Force. I've been working for the NATO advisory team. So I'm very sad because I haven't heard three very nice words: ceasefire, negotiations, and peace. So everybody talked about the weapons and more troops, but nobody mentioned the peace. So I think this war is not good for European people, because there are 100 million people in Europe, so it's not good for us. So I believe that we should stop this war as soon as possible, and after that to create a much more better environment. So I don't think that we want to fight until the last Ukrainian soldier. So it's not the solution. We should stop this and to create a much more better environment for us.
Thank you. Over here, please, microphone.
Thank you for all your excellent contributions. I was very much interested in the speech by Mrs. Seskuria. I think that what we might face after the war in Ukraine, which Ukraine will hopefully with our help win, is a Russia that is militarily defeated but will have all the possibilities to continue with the war they are already very good at, to divide us with disinformation, with cyber attacks and so on. Many people say that you can totally destroy another country without any military means at all, if you are very skillful at that. And that is my fear. We have many fears now, but one of the fears for me is that the disinformation that is destroying us, destroying Georgia's possibilities right now, destroying Swedish possibilities to become a member in the very near future, and so on and so on. It is a very powerful means, and Russia is good at it. I know that NATO and the European Union are cooperating on this issue, but I would like to hear a little bit more about how you see on this thing. Thank you.
Sure. Over there, please.
Thank you again. My question is about the, and actually that's kind of a response to our Hungarian colleague. There was a question from Sandro about the seriousness of NATO countries to support Ukraine, and this seriousness has to be translated into the ability of NATO to understand strategically how the strategic outcome of this war would look like. And as a Clausewitzian, I would argue war is a political affair. So how the political end outcome of this war would look like for NATO, you know, in Russia, in post-Soviet area, because without understanding of the political outcome, there is no understanding how you're going to wage war, with what resources, financial, military, etc., etc. And that leads us to the question about the ceasefire, etc., etc., which is actually another kind of formulation of the inability to understand the political outcome of the war. So my question again to you, is there kind of a joint understanding? We always say that Russia must be defeated, that Ukraine should win, but how you would translate it in political, we know how it should be translated in military affairs domain, but how you understand it, this picture strategically in political dimension. Thank you.
Any other questions? Please.
Hello, my name is Tamri Konechkabia. I would have the question to the ambassador of Romania to Georgia. Like, there were incidents when Ukrainian ships were going to the Romania, like wheat ships for the food ships mostly, and there were incidents when Russia bombed those ships. What can you see as an opportunity for the coastline of Romania as a military ships, for instance? Like, what are the future for strengthening them? Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Would you like to tackle?
Sure. I mean,
Start.
in response to the point about ceasefire and peace, I mean, everybody wants to see peace, but it's got to be a lasting peace. And it's got to be a peace on terms that Ukrainians set, not us. Absolutely the worst thing to happen would be for a bunch of us to sit around in a room like this and dictate the terms on which Ukraine should settle. Because we know how that ends. That ends with it all happening again. We tried that in 2014. It was a total failure. Years and years of Russia running rings round the international community in bad faith negotiations while preparing for a resumption of conflict. So NATO is not at war. It is not up to us to determine how this war ends. The Ukrainians are at war. Our job is to support the Ukrainians, to put them in the strongest possible position so that they can determine in their country who controls what territory and what their future security orientation is. That is not our job. That is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to support them as they fight for European values and for the principles of the UN Charter.
Thank you. Please.
If I may, Sandro, just to continue in the same vein as Ambassador Quarrey, as our president mentioned, the only party that has the right to say to talk about peace is Ukraine, because Ukraine has been under attack since 2014, so it's up to Ukraine to decide the moment. As Ambassador Quarrey said, NATO is not at war, therefore will not be part in the negotiations. Thank you very much.
Sure. Natia, please.
Very much agree with the ambassadors, and I would like to just add a few points. I don't really believe in brokering a peace deal with Russia unless we have a full defeat on Russia on the battlefield, because we have seen this before. We have seen this in 2008 when there was a the 6-point ceasefire agreement brokered by the French president. We have seen this in Ukraine in 2014. We had the Minsk agreements, but Putin doesn't work that way. If you give Putin if you agree on concessions, he will use this against you. And I think premature peace is very dangerous for Ukraine. In a longer-term perspective, and I think Ukrainians have learned their lessons from their history, and in that sense, I think President Zelensky, who has a very tough standing when, and we hear all the time there are suggestions that maybe it's time for Ukrainians to sit at the negotiation table, and I would also fully agree that it is not anyone else, even the closest partner of Ukraine, to suggest that to Ukrainians, because they are paying the ultimate price. Conscious that, of course, the Western support has been huge, billions of dollars we are speaking about, but at the same time this is an existential war for Ukraine, and in that sense I do not believe in premature peace. I fear the premature peace, and especially when it comes to the current counteroffensive and some of the suggestions that maybe the counteroffensive is slow. We know it's slow, but the expectation from Ukraine to advance quickly and achieve territorial gains when there is such a strong Russian fortifications, Russian defenses, and Russians had months to prepare for that. We cannot expect from Ukraine simply to do the miracle on the battlefield. So in that sense, I think any conversation that forces Ukraine and puts a pressure on Ukraine to sit down at the negotiation table would be hugely disadvantageous for the West as well, because the West will be dealing with these consequences later.
For sure. It's not only problematic for Ukraine, but for the whole Euro-Atlantic community. Dr. Shea, would you like to give us some final remarks?
I can't resist the temptation, Sandro, although all of the good points, which I totally agree with, have been made by everybody on the panel. Just on the peace issue, there's a US think tank, unfortunately not mine, Chatham House, but which has done an interesting study showing that so far Russia has violated 125 international treaties and agreements in invading Ukraine. They extend, to deliberate targeting of civilians, maternity clinics, deliberate putting in danger nuclear power stations, environmental harm, reckless mining, deportation of children. On it goes, and of course, that's why the International Criminal Court is going to spend many long years looking into all of this, and has already issued an indictment against Putin. I'm sure there'll be indictments of him and the Russian leadership for many other things. Can you think of an agreement that Putin has signed that he's kept? I can't. Maybe there is one, but you'll have a hard time finding one. Even agreements, for example, to provide immunity to Yevgeny Prigozhin the other day didn't hold for very long, did it? So yes, I mean, peace without justice, I agree, is only a provisional peace. What are the objectives, the outcome issue? Again, we could spend many long hours on this, but for me, essentially, they are, number one, to preserve Ukraine as an independent, functioning state, functioning politically, economically, tied to the West, capable of self-determination. Number two, we tilt the battlefield. I'm actually borrowing from Victoria Newland here, so I have to sort of declare my sources, but I agree with her, to tilt the battlefield in such a way that Russia is not tempted to do this kind of operation again. Number three, to have an outcome which deters other potential dictators elsewhere in the world from similar acts of aggression. And number four, and I agree with this, whatever the outcome, it seems difficult to believe that we would end up with a friendly Russia, unless we had the spectacular sort of regime transformation that we experienced, and I was at NATO, fortunately enough to live it, back in 1989 with Gorbachev and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we're likely under any scenario to have a resentful, revanchist Russia. And so some kind of long-term strategy for dealing with that while protecting states like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, bringing them into the camp, as I mentioned, is going to be key. So that's what I've said about outcomes. Final comment, hybrid war. The lady who intervened on that was very interesting, but I beg to differ a little bit, having dealt at NATO with cyber in my day. I think the Ukrainians have shown very well that they've been able to cope with that Russian onslaught, and it really has been an onslaught of cyber attacks, of disinformation campaigns, of sabotage. In the war, they've been excellent at minimizing the impact of cyber, which once we thought would be, Cybergeddon or Cyber Pearl Harbor, a war winner. And I personally believe it's because of the failure of Russian hybrid warfare tactics vis-a-vis Ukraine that Putin ultimately has resorted to military force. So I differ, ma'am. I take your point about the seriousness of this type of thing, but I think what we're seeing is that the only way that you can destroy a country is using military force, and to the extent that the hybrid stuff doesn't work and we become more resilient. The bad news, and again as a think taker, I deal now more in the bad news side of the story. The bad news is that could make potential aggressors more determined to use military tactics, believing that tanks win where, if you like, cyberspace doesn't. Anyway, that would be a thought at least. But again, Sandro, thank you so much for entertaining me from Brussels this evening, and I thoroughly enjoyed the experience and the interaction, and I learned much more than I was able to supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shea. Just to add on your comment, and I'll come to you, you mentioned some kind of long-term strategy for Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, and there is no better strategy than becoming a NATO member. So hopefully that will happen at some point. So last comment, please, Ambassador Rotundu, and we'll finish.
Thank you very much. I mean, as NATO never drafts forces states, for the time being, the Republic of Moldova is not interested in joining NATO, so I'm sure they will take the decision when time will be ripe. Now, concerning the attacks on the Ukrainian ships, so far we have confirmed attacks in the Ukrainian territorial waters or on the open seas, not in the Romanian waters. Romania will continue to support the transit of Ukrainian grains without any problem, and as we expressed during our talks with the Secretary General of NATO, we will step up the defense on the territorial waters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I think it's time to wrap up. I think we indeed covered quite many topics, and very fruitfully, hopefully. I would like to ask you to thank all of our speakers with a round of applause. Thanks. I would like to say goodbye to Dr. Jamie. Hopefully for only some time, and hopefully we'll see you in Georgia. And for all others, I would like to ask you to join us in the restaurant, which is, I think, another interesting part of our event. So, thank you. Thank you all.